Hello, am I clear? Yes, all right, thanks very much. I'm going to just offer some reflections on modernization and dreaming in Gopo Singh's important 1972 novel, If We Dream Too Long, which was released again recently, courtesy of NUS Press and through Dr. Kota An's efforts. So I think it's attempt. It's 42 years ago since it was published, and my reflection, I think, is to try to recover some of the specific, you might call it English-educated, liberal, progressive critique of modernization. And I think 42 years on, we can reflect upon what it means now, given the context of modernization in the early 1970s, which is really just 5, 6, 7 years after independence, after Singapore left Malaysia, and some years down the road, and think about what creativity and dreaming might mean when we look back at a novel like this. So let me tell you a bit about Gopo Singh. This is from the National Library's website. And in other words, he's become, after all these years, a person with some official arts recognition, right, that the National Library can put it up. So it says, Gopo Singh, born 1936, Kuala Lumpur, Malaya, and notice Malaya, when Malaysia and Singapore, West Malaysia is one thing, died 10th January 2010, only a few years ago, in Vancouver. Physician, poet laureate, prize-winning writer and entrepreneur, played an active role in Singapore arts following the country's independence. He was a pioneer of Singapore English drama, as well as the author of the first Singapore novel, If We Dream Too Long. It won the National Book Development Council of Singapore's Fiction Book Award in 1976, 4 years after it was published, and has been translated into other languages like Russian and Japanese. He was a Cultural Medallion winner of Literature in 1982. So the National Library website goes on to say that he was an avid promoter of the arts in Singapore, the very first chairman of the National Theatre Trust when we had a national theatre. He was therefore, you might say, a public intellectual. I'm not sure the term existed in Singapore in the 1960s and 70s, in the arts in those days. And interestingly enough, it also goes on to mention that Go was a great promoter of music as well. He opened Singapore's first theatre disco lounge, Rainbow Lounge, opposite the Hard Rock Cafe. It's this arcade that's a bit run down now. He organized the first David Bowie concert in Singapore in 1983, an event that incurred huge expenses but was poorly received by the public. So we weren't terribly cutting edge in 1983, I don't think. And here it also goes on to add that Go also envisioned a lively and trendy Singapore river in the 1970s, which included restaurants, shops, and a bustling nightlife. Despite submissions or plans to the government, Go's vision was not taken seriously. Today, the Singapore River has embraced his vision, making Go a man with ideas that were ahead of his time. So I think that's very interesting, because then he's located in a larger cultural problematic of creativity and innovation in Singapore and in imagining what the city can be. As I say, I think it's quite interesting now, 40 years after the book was published and he left Singapore, to look back and think of the issues he was dealing with. Now, in terms of the novel, If We Dream Too Long, it basically deals with the youth, Guang Ming, and he lives in a new block then, of 3-room flats somewhere in Tiong Bahru or somewhere in the Outram area. He used to live in Chinatown. And it's interesting, again, to think of that history. And it's a city-state in transition. The British have left. The heroic fights of the 50s and 60s seem to have been largely settled. Development is taking off. And his friend Hock Lai observes, "We come too late on the scene, our generation, after the action is over. Now no one wants us. We are only digits." This is a reference to a term that the first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew made, used of Singaporeans. "We are only digits. How I wish I belonged to that period. What a freedom fighter I would make." So it's interesting. It's 72 and he already thinks history has come to an end. Now, he's lower middle class. Father's a shipping clerk, dialect-speaking family, but of course the father has to speak English because he's in the shipping firm. he, I think, actually does well enough to go to University of Singapore, but there's no money. And therefore, he's not qualified enough, even though he's got what is called a senior Cambridge cert, something like A-levels, I guess, in those days. So he's educated, but not enough to meet the times. And he's not entrepreneurial. He's a slightly sort of passive boy. Now, he meets a teacher next door, older than him, married, and this chap's normal trained. He's been to what's called Teachers Training College, now NIE, and he doesn't have a degree, so there's a contrast with him and someone else who's done well. And they introduced me to a young girl, the cousin of the wife, and so there's hope, you see, love and all that. But then the neighbor, his name is Buntik, also tells him, now I don't think he's meant to be the voice of the government, but there's an element of that. Buntik says to him, I don't know who actually speaks like this, but if they can be made to realize that their work, those people who do ordinary work, is essential, that it contributes something, that they are helping their society to prosper and progress, then they might be able to find satisfaction in the fact that they are instrumental in transforming society so that it's a better society for their children and their children's children. Then they might find, if not satisfaction, if not happiness, at least some solace. So there you are in 1972, ordinary people just find solace. And here we are, the children's children are now alive, young, but alive. If Kwang Ming was alive today, I guess he'd be like 62 or something like that, around that age. Yeah? So Kwang Ming gives up dreaming. Why? Because he can't move on, and then his father becomes ill, and he becomes the oldest son who supports the siblings, you see. So he is condemned, he feels, to play this bit part. In school, he played Balthazar, who has like one line in The Merchant of Venice. There you are, this is a one-line young man. Yeah? And he gives up hope. He stands on the balcony. I think this is actually worthwhile listening to see how public housing, the romantic image of the moon, are used. This is after he's decided he'll give up on his girlfriend as well. He was surprised on looking up to find nearly a full moon overhead. Kwang Ming looked out of the balcony across the blocks of flats to the distant glow in the sky due to the thousands of lights in the city, and at the neighboring identical block next to theirs standing silhouetted in the bright silver night. He heard a grating noise beside him and found that his father had joined him on the balcony. He looked at his father's thin, intense face with those strange, soft eyes of one who's sick. There was a sad smile hovering on the father's lips. Nice moon, his father commented. Yes, Pa. You should be out enjoying yourself, he said softly. There's nowhere to go. There's always somewhere to go when you're young, his father said with a smile. No, there's nowhere to go. So the thing is, as we look at this, we get an image of a young Singaporean trapped in Singapore, and this novel is full of these sort of classic colonial era, post-colonial era signs of escape, the desire for snow in London, the Himalayas, the V.S. Naipaul novels are filled with that sense of the metropolitan center and cold weather, which we never have in Singapore, right? The individual cannot find fulfillment. The meritocratic ladder of the new Singapore and the dream concept linked to meritocracy are flawed. He's trapped by the rationalistic state, the modernizing state, the homogenizing state, all signs of the changes of the times. So public housing, interestingly enough, it sort of gives the founding image, as it were, for Eric Khoo's 12 Stories and all those films that occur. So public housing, maybe somewhat unfairly, becomes an image of the trapped Singaporean within a hyper-rationalized system, right? These are all signs of upheavals that are going on in the 70s as the economy is churning. So public image becomes an image of the blandness of Singapore life, and the romantic of the image, the moon, is unable in the context of the new of 1972 to offer hope. Someone like Kwang Ming and one of his friends, Aziz, who has the equivalent of secondary 2 education, are reduced to not being able to move on, right? So in the end, he becomes a passive individual. There's no ability to be heroic because of the times that don't allow this. This is this hyper-rational, pragmatic Singapore which had no space for fun. There's a very specific context for this utterance, though, this utterance of this novel, which is that, you might say, of the English-speaking, English-educated fraction that's liberal in its orientation. Now, these days, in Singapore, class is used as a very blunt term to indicate financial earnings, I suppose, but really it has to do with language, you spoke English, what do you speak, how long you've been speaking English, and in other words, Goh Po Seng is part of a very privileged part of society as a doctor who's been educated at University College Dublin, and he's critical of the state's pragmatism and its rationalism, hence a reference to digits. And he himself, I suppose some people would have considered him the sort of soft humanism that is still participating in the educated middle-class English liberal culture that Singapore inherited. Class is not a matter of money alone, and he was part of that fraction. All right, so in conclusion then, we want to ask, why must Quang Meng fail? And what are the implications for the present? Quang Meng must fail. He must dump the girlfriend unnecessarily because the system must be shown to be harsh. There's a two cultures debate then, the late 50s and early 60s, C.P. Snow and F.R. Leavis, literary aesthetic culture and scientific culture. The book is clearly showing which side the government of Singapore is on, the scientific side, right? And so this is a world of standardization and discipline that was part of the modernist development agenda. So the question is, how has this worked, and what is the legacy of this right now in the present? In the present, in contrast to the 1970s, we want the raw, we want the edgy, we want the outspoken, the creative, perhaps all those things that Goh Po Seng was, and not part of that era. So the question is, what has standardization done to us in terms of reducing diversity in Singapore? Now, this issues of race and all that, and standardization to sort of create separate spaces and tolerance in Singapore, we don't want to trivialize that attempt at social engineering, but there are other issues besides race here, and I don't think race is a primary concern. It's not a concern at all in this novel. So did we get what we want? Did we get what we want for the children's children when we want diversity back? So Goh Po Seng was ahead of his time, and that's rightly stated by the National Library Board. Last year, tech startups in Singapore attracted $1.71 billion in venture capital. So what's involved in creativity now is a very different conception of what was development in the 1970s. So I think dreaming in Goh Po Seng suggests that from a very humanistic perspective, right, this sort of old English style humanism, that for Quang Meng, when he stops dreaming, life is just existence rather than living, which of course brings to mind, in terms of the present, a biblical text, Galatians 6:7. Be not deceived, for whatsoever a man soweth, that also shall he reap. Thank you.